What is the point of philosophy? When people philosophize, what are they actually doing? Is it just a waste of time? Is it better to be ignorant instead? Happily ignorant? What's going on when people talk about philosophy? And the reason why I'm asking myself this question is because as part of this bigger playlist where I'm building this library of psychology and philosophy books, especially to guide your inner work and your self-discovery, there comes a point which is, what's the point of an insight to begin with? And that's the question which itself is nested inside, what's the point of doing philosophy at all? And I think for me, given that I've been a philosophy teacher for 10 years, the answer comes with a book like this, which is best understood by the ancient idea of philosophy, which is philosophy as a way of life. One big criticism that I definitely have of the modern philosophical world, especially as it's taught in education, is that it's very, very abstract. It's much more to do with language games than anything else, and semantics, and people arguing about specific definitions rather than actually doing anything about it in their life. And the whole point of this journey, the whole point of this self-discovery is to have these insights and to put them into practice. I've said multiple times over in this playlist, is to take a decisive stance towards existence. By that, what I'm referring to is you're deciding, given all of these, given the context and given the circumstances that are around you, here's who I am and here's how I'm going to show up regardless. And that's what makes philosophy as a way of life particularly important. And when I'm talking about all of this as well, given that I'm a teacher and a coach and a mentor, it's worth understanding what's going on. If you see a lot of videos online at this point in time and a lot of conversations you might have with people, they're directly or indirectly giving you advice and saying that based on my experience, here's what you should do. And that's not always useful. It's not always helpful. The point of philosophy should be to help form your opinions, not inform them. So just to make that really clear, the point of philosophy, at least for me, is to help form, not inform. It's to help you realize how is it that I can structure my own rules, my own life, my own way of thinking, my own way of being, rather than just seeing what works for other people and then directly copying and pasting it onto my life, because that's not giving any kind of credit to the nuances that make me me. It's also grossly oversimplifying what actually happens in their life as well, and why it might not even be relevant. Even if they directly gave us the advice, it might be that they don't really know how it is or why it is that they were successful. There's a lot of narratives within all this. There's a lot of stories. So when we need to think about philosophy, we need to think about how to live it, not just to speak about it. And one thing that can be really useful, and it's a great little spiritual exercise, which you can find within this book, and there's whole topics on ancient spiritual exercises, basically things that you can do on a repeated basis and practices to be able to be the man or the woman that you want to be. And one of them is to come up with a rule in advance, knowing that if you're going to face a moral dilemma, what is it that you're going to do? If you can burn a rule into your mind, then essentially means that you can rely on that whenever you're a little bit uncertain, whenever you're confused about what to do or which future to move towards, especially if the focus is going to be on short-term comfort versus long-term fulfillment. It's a real battle. There's a real tension between those two things there. But if we can think about a rule in advance, something which is going to be guiding us towards that desired future, then what's going to happen is then in that moment we realize, oh, actually, when we apply that rule, one thing breaks away. And all of a sudden, it's much easier without that blockage to wholeheartedly focus on one area. Now, earlier in this series, I mentioned The Doctor and the Soul by Viktor Frankl, and I think he comes up with a wonderful example of one of those rules in here. I did read it out in that video, but I'm aware that it was a little bit of a wordy point, and I want to try to just explain it again here, just to show you that a lot of these books that I'm recommending, they do actually link together. So just to quote an example from Viktor Frankl about how he might come up with a rule like this, it's this: to live as if you were living for a second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you are about to act now. Again, to live as if you were living for a second time and had acted as wrongly, the first time as you are about to act now. Because what happens is when we've got a rule like that in our mind, if we assume, let's say we're in that situation again where we can't overthink, we can't overanalyze, we've got 5 to 10 seconds to make a decision and we don't know what to do. If we just assume in our head, what happens if this had already gone wrong? How would I like to improve it? then in that situation, suddenly one option is going to break away. It might be that we've already started to think about that. We've already premeditated an idea on this. And when that moment comes in where we're called to act, life calls something from us to act and make a decision, it becomes much easier to be able to align yourself, to become much more resilient with all of this as well, and to move forwards in full conviction of an answer and an idea, knowing that you can genuinely embody it rather than some parts of you being for it, some parts of you being against it. So it's so important to be able to consider this, because what we need to do is, like I was saying, to make philosophy as a way of life, we need to consider it not as an abstract exercise where we're sat in an armchair and we're thinking, what might we do in this really weird, bizarre moral situation? It's realizing that, that might be quite fun to be able to talk to your friends about. On a practical level, you're going to need philosophy to be able to deal with your actual problems. Very famously, you've got the trolley problem of if you've got a train carriage which is moving and you've got the ability to pull a lever, and if you pull it, it's going to hit and kill one person, and if you don't, it'll just hit 5 people. That's fine to be able to consider all the factors and what is right or what is wrong to do in a situation like that, but realistically, it's never going to happen. Whereas the real problem that comes in of, okay, well, I've got a real debate here as, do I go to the gym like I promised to myself and I want to be able to become physically fit, or do I stay an extra 2 hours at work to get all the jobs done, to make tomorrow easier? It's a much, much lower stakes, but there's a real tension. What is it that I prefer? What future am I moving towards? Is it the one where I'm more physically fit, or is it the one where I've prioritized work? And I can't answer that for you. But if that is going to be a real dilemma, then you need to be presented with a rule that can help you manage that can actually put that into practice. Because when we start to understand this, we can start to realize, actually, we need this structure in place to be able to act efficiently, to be able to act like with full enthusiasm overall. And that's exactly what ancient philosophy is all about. I know stoicism, especially on YouTube over the past few years, has had a real push, and I can really understand why. If you can adopt some of the virtues within stoicism that focus on much more famously to be an example of a good man rather than worrying about what a good man should be, it's much more grounded, it's much more focused on the body at this point in time and the present. Again, if we link back to other books in this series, I mentioned earlier in this series this book Pleasure by Alexander Lowen. The idea here being that a creative life and full self-expression isn't just an idea about who you are in an abstract sense, it's grounded in the body. You can tell a person and their personality and their characteristics by how they show up in the world, how they occupy space, how they speak, the tone of their voice, the flavor of the voice, the eye contact, the body language, how free-flowing they are, how rigid they are. All of that can be understood in a bioenergetic approach in terms of how is it that they're showing up in space. And this is going to be a really complementary book to something like this when we consider it on the abstract, more mental angle about what are these rules I should live so that it is in service towards my life, to make philosophy as a way of life. Hopefully with all these things, you can start to see how little stacks of books appear. If you were to read, for example, these 3 books in a row, where you go from pleasure through to Doctor and the Soul, through to philosophy as a way of life, suddenly across 3 very different approaches and 3 very different methodologies, you've got a real backing. You know how to act. You know how to start to consider values on very different ways. You can understand your physical self and your emotional and your mental and your spiritual and your shadow self, and what values look like according to each of them. And also, what is the attitude that you should have towards life, if we go back to this example? And how do we have the right attitude towards life? Well, that's where this book comes back in. That's where we need to start to think about it as, what are the rules that we live by? And that's just looking at 3 books in this series, let alone all of them. That's what this project is all about. It's realizing, how is it that one book doesn't just stand on its own, but how is it that we can keep a conversation going across all these books? Where are these 2 books in agreement with each other? Where do they disagree with each other? And more importantly, what is it that I'm going to do about it? How am I going to assimilate this into my personality overall? But the point that I want to make with all of this is hopefully, it's the point that I started with, is that philosophy should be here to help us form and not inform. It should help us form the person that we want to become and the lifestyle that we want to have, not inform us, specifically saying the content of this book will tell you how to live. That's not what it's about. It's here to give you exercises, and it's to give you ideas and biographies as well of famous people and philosophers that have gone before us to show how they actually embodied it as well, and what type of people that they were, so that we can start to look at them as mentors, take them off that pedestal, and realize that within ourselves about what we should do. Hopefully you can start to see now the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about all these books and why I genuinely love this process of reading. It's because suddenly you're not just reading a book anymore, you're building a library. It's much bigger than this. You've elevated the simple act of reading to something so much bigger. It becomes a project, it becomes a way of life, it becomes a way of being, and that is infused into my personality. And that's why people now realistically in my day-to-day life know me as the book guy. That wasn't me 2 years ago, 3 years ago, definitely not. I struggled at that start, whereas now it's a real part of my identity. And that's helped because I know how much it has benefited me. I know how much easier life is now compared to how I used to think of myself in my life. And it's because of all these books. So just to be nice and clear, the book recommendation for this particular video is this one, Philosophy as a Way of Life by, I think it's pronounced Pierre Hadot. Could be wrong there, but it's just to make things practical, not abstract, in the body, practical. What are you going to do with the insights that you have? There's plenty more videos to come, plenty more book recommendations to come, and we're going to we're going to continue this on the next part of the playlist. Again, I'll see you over there.